The small cafe was a quiet refuge for the woman, a brief escape from the chaos of her life. Between jobs, she found solace in this little corner, where the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee could momentarily soothe her weary mind. Her clothes were simple, nothing flashy, just a worn-out sweater and a pair of jeans that had seen better days. But they were the best she had. She didn't mind. For now, she just needed a few minutes of peace. The door to the cafe chimed as it swung open, breaking the silence. She barely glanced up as the man walked in. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a sharp suit, his polished shoes clicking against the floor with each step. His expensive watch gleamed under the soft cafe lights, and his posture exuded a confidence that came with wealth. He walked straight to the counter, barely giving the other customers a second look. As he ordered his coffee, his eyes wandered around the room, scanning the patrons with a cool indifference. And then they landed on her. His gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary, taking in the woman sitting in the corner. His expression shifted ever so slightly, a subtle sneer. Like he couldn't fathom why someone like her would be in a place like this. She tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the warmth of her cup, but it was hard to shake off the feeling that she had already been judged. His glance told her everything she needed to know. She was invisible to him, a mere afterthought in his world. The man took his coffee and casually walked to a table near hers, his eyes never leaving her. She tried to ignore him, focusing on the coffee in her hands, hoping the moment would pass. But of course, it didn't. He slid into the chair across from her without asking, his presence looming like an unwanted shadow. "Do you mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice smooth and condescending. She didn't respond at first, hoping he would take the hint and move on, but his smirk only deepened as he continued. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "this is a nice cafe. Not exactly the kind of place for someone dressed like you." His eyes scanned her worn sweater and faded jeans, as if taking inventory of everything that set her apart from him. "I mean, no offense, but I would expect someone who frequents a place like this to at least look like they can afford it." He chuckled to himself, as if his own joke was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Her heart sank, a knot of humiliation tightening in her chest. She looked down at her hands, clutched tightly around her coffee cup. But she couldn't escape the feeling that the entire cafe had turned to listen. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, her hands trembling as she tried to control her breath. It wasn't just his words that stung, it was the way he said them. As if her presence was a mistake, as if she was the one out of place. She wanted to snap back, to tell him he didn't know anything about her, but the words felt like they were stuck in her throat. The other patrons continued their quiet conversations, oblivious to the tension building in the room. The man, oblivious to her discomfort, took a sip of his coffee and continued with his verbal assault. "People like you should stick to the smaller cafes," he added, eyes gliding over her, "places where you actually belong." Each word felt like a punch to her dignity. She fought the urge to stand up and walk out, but she knew deep down she was trapped. In that moment, her self-worth seemed smaller than ever before. As the man's words continued to echo in her mind, the woman couldn't help but let her thoughts drift back to her past. It was a place she didn't visit often. But in moments like these, it felt like everything she had worked for was nothing more than a fragile illusion. She had grown up in a small, run-down neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, a place where dreams were a luxury few could afford. Her parents worked tirelessly, her mother as a waitress and her father in construction, but even their combined efforts couldn't provide a life without struggle. Money was always tight, and luxuries were something she only saw in movies or on the shelves of the store, never something she could reach. When she was just 14, her mother passed away suddenly. The illness had come quickly, and with it, the silence that followed. Her father, devastated by the loss, turned to drink. The house that once had the sound of laughter and warmth became cold and empty. She had to grow up fast, learning to fend for herself and find ways to survive. The small dreams she had of becoming someone important, someone worthy, seemed so distant. Every day felt like a battle to simply get by. By the time she was 17, her father, too, had passed, leaving her alone to navigate the world. She didn't have time to grieve. She had to work, picking up any job she could find, from cleaning offices at night to working in a convenience store during the day. Her ambitions of going to college, of building a better life for herself, became something that seemed impossible. The weight of reality pressed down on her shoulders, and she had to swallow her pride every time she was told she didn't have the qualifications, the experience, or the right connections to get ahead. But she had never given up. No matter how many times she was told no, no matter how many times life knocked her down, she kept dreaming. She dreamed of a life where she could stand tall, where she could look at herself in the mirror without feeling ashamed. She still believed, deep down, that something could change. That one day, someone would see her for who she was, strong, determined, and worthy of more. A few days after the humiliating encounter in the cafe, the woman's life took an unexpected turn. It was a quiet afternoon when her phone rang, its jarring sound breaking the silence of her small apartment. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, and for a moment she considered letting it go to voicemail. But something inside her told her to pick up. "Hello? Is this Miss Taylor?" The voice on the other end was smooth and professional, sending a ripple of nervousness through her chest. "Yes, this is she," she replied, trying to steady her breath. "I'm calling from Donovan and Hall, a consulting firm. We've reviewed your resume and we'd like to invite you for an interview for an assistant position. Could you come in this week?" Her heart skipped a beat. She had sent out countless resumes over the past few months, but this one, this particular call, felt different. The company was prestigious, known for hiring the best of the best. She hadn't expected a response from them, not in a million years. Who was she, after all? Just another person struggling to make ends meet. "I'd be honored," she stammered, still in shock. The woman hung up the phone, her hands trembling. She sat down on her worn couch, her mind racing. The job sounded like a dream, but deep down, doubt gnawed at her. Was she really qualified for something like this? She had no degrees from fancy universities, no impressive job titles to back her up. Just years of hard work and a determination that never seemed to fade. But as she looked out the window at the city below, a flicker of hope sparked in her heart. This could be the chance she had been waiting for, the moment that could finally change everything. She quickly made the decision. She would go. Even if she wasn't sure she belonged, she would walk through those doors and give it her all. She couldn't let fear hold her back anymore. The morning of the interview arrived with a mixture of excitement and dread. The woman stood outside the towering building of Donovan and Hall, looking up at its sleek, glass exterior. The city's hustle and bustle felt distant here, like she had entered a different world. One where people dressed in suits, carried briefcases, and exuded confidence with every step. She felt out of place, her nerves tightening with each passing moment. But she took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked through the revolving doors. Inside, the lobby was polished, pristine, and cold, a far cry from the small cafe she had visited just days before. She checked in with the receptionist, who sent her upstairs to the interview room. Her heart pounded as she waited outside, her mind filled with self-doubt. She hadn't expected to get this far, and now that she was here, she felt the weight of her inadequacy. When the door finally opened, she stepped inside with her head held high, despite the nervous flutter in her chest. But as her eyes scanned the room, her breath caught in her throat. Sitting at the head of the table, dressed in the same sharp suit from the cafe, was the man. The one who had humiliated her just days ago. He looked just as polished as before, but now, as their eyes met, something in his expression shifted. His confident demeanor faltered for a brief moment, and his eyes widened as recognition hit him. Her stomach churned with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Of all the people to be in charge of this interview, it had to be him? She tried to keep her face neutral, hiding the surge of emotion that threatened to bubble up. The man's face fell, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his facade. He quickly adjusted his posture, clearing his throat as he stood. "Miss Taylor," he said, his voice now polite and strained, It's good to see you again." His tone was almost apologetic, but there was a nervousness in his eyes that didn't escape her notice. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to mask his earlier arrogance. It was as though the tables had turned, and now he was the one who felt small. She took her seat, forcing herself to remain calm, though a small part of her enjoyed the irony of the situation. The man, who had once looked down on her, was now clearly rattled by the very person he had dismissed so easily. The interview room was silent for a moment, as both of them processed the awkwardness in the air. The woman could feel his eyes on her, trying to gauge whether she would say something, whether she would show any sign of the resentment that was surely simmering beneath the surface. But she didn't. She kept her posture straight, her expression neutral. She had worked too hard to let the past define her. In that moment, her past struggles, the years of self-doubt, the humiliations, the long hours of hard work, didn't matter. What mattered now was her present, the opportunity before her. "Shall we begin?" she asked calmly, her voice steady. The man blinked, his discomfort palpable. He quickly nodded and began to go over the questions, his usual arrogance replaced by a careful politeness. She noticed how he hesitated slightly, choosing his words with more caution than before. Every question he asked was met with a confident, thoughtful answer from her. She had prepared for this moment, had imagined this conversation countless times, and now that it was happening, she was ready. As the interview continued, she could sense the shift in the power dynamics. Where once she had been the one to feel small, now it was him. His earlier dismissiveness had transformed into an almost desperate need to prove himself to her. He asked about her experience, her goals, trying to navigate the conversation in a way that would somehow regain his composure. But every answer she gave, every word that came out of her mouth, only served to chip away at the wall he had built around himself. He was starting to see her. Really see her. Not as a poor woman in a cafe, not as someone he could easily dismiss, but as someone who was capable, intelligent, and worthy of respect. By the time the interview ended, the man had gone from condescending to almost apologetic. "Thank you for your time, Miss Taylor," he said, his voice no longer laced with arrogance. "We'll be in touch." As she stood to leave, a small but powerful smile tugged at her lips. The power had shifted, and now she was the one in control. She knew, without a doubt, that she had just made him confront everything he thought he knew about people like her, and that realization would stay with him long after she had walked out the door. A week later, she received the call. Her heart raced as she listened to the voice on the other end. "Miss Taylor, we are pleased to offer you the position. We believe you'll be a great fit for the team." Her legs went weak with relief, but she didn't let herself break down. This was what she had worked for, what she had fought for. She had finally made it, after years of struggle, of doubting herself, of believing that something like this was beyond her reach. As she hung up the phone, a sense of pride washed over her. Not just because she had gotten the job, but because she had proven something to herself. She had held her ground against the man who once thought so little of her. She had shown him that she was more than her circumstances, that she was capable, strong, and deserving of success. The first day at her new job felt surreal. She walked through the polished halls of the company building, her mind still buzzing from the fact that she was here. She had done it. As the day ended, she stepped out of the building, her head held high. The man who had humiliated her was nowhere to be found, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt empowered, like the world had just opened up to her. She walked down the street with a quiet confidence, knowing that this was only the beginning. Her future, once uncertain, now lay ahead of her, full of possibilities. If you enjoyed this story and felt inspired by the journey of resilience and self-discovery, please consider showing your support. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss an uplifting tale. If this story resonated with you, give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you know someone who could use a little inspiration, make sure to share this video with them. Your support means the world and helps us keep bringing you more stories like this. Thank you.